In the freezing darkness of January 1884, a polar vortex locked itself over Montana Territory. 40 miles south of the Canadian border, the wind did not merely howl. It cut through log walls like a razored blade. Outside the town of Silver Creek, the mercury dropped to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. It was the kind of cold that turns spit to ice before it strikes the dirt, the kind of air that burns the throat and makes pine timber snap like dry bone in the dead of night. Inside almost every homestead cabin across Flathead County, families were trapped in an exhausting nightmare. Fathers stood over roaring fireplaces, throwing split Douglas fir into the flames every 2 hours, fighting a losing battle against physics. Within 3 feet of the hearth, the air was hot enough to scorch wool blankets. But 8 feet away, near the sleeping pallets, ice formed inside the water buckets, and children froze under 4 layers of heavy quilts. Yet, on an isolated claim overlooking the valley, one cabin stood silent and motionless under the starlight. No roaring fire blazed in its hearth. No wood was tossed into the flames after midnight. Inside, a Chinese railroad worker named Chun Wei, his wife Jean, and their 2 young children slept soundly in light cotton nightclothes. At 6 o'clock in the morning, while the wild winds pushed the outside air down to minus 38 degrees, a medical doctor placed a glass thermometer on a shelf inside Chun Wei's cabin. The mercury climbed and settled at 56 degrees Fahrenheit. Near the surface where the family slept, it read 72 degrees. And the fire in the firebox had been completely dead for over 3 hours. Think about that for a second. While every experienced builder in 3 counties was burning through 10 cords of firewood to keep their homes barely above freezing, Chun Wei was using 1/3 of the fuel, maintaining absolute comfort, and sleeping straight through the coldest night in Montana history. Now, picture this. Just 6 months earlier, the master mason of Silver Creek had stood in the doorway of that same cabin, pointed at Chun Wei's half-built stone platform, and declared it a dangerous joke. He warned the town that this foreign contraption would smoke the family out by October, burn the cabin to the ground by November, or collapse and crush them under 900 pounds of stone by December. They were dead wrong. What took place inside that humble log structure was not magic, nor was it luck. It was thermal engineering that had kept human beings alive through Siberian winters for over 2,000 years, an ancient mastery of thermal mass and radiant heat that American experts claimed was impossible. Stay with me here, because what happened next forced an entire frontier settlement to confront their own ignorance, and it is the exact reason modern off-grid engineers are now rediscovering what Chun Wei knew in 1883. Before we step deeper into the heart of this relentless winter storm, take a quick second to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below letting me know where you are watching from and what winter means in your corner of the world right now. I want to know the coldest temperature you have ever faced and whether your heating system kept you safe or left you shivering in the dark. To truly understand why Chun Wei's radical design worked, we have to look at the brutal reality of the Montana frontier in 1882. Chun Wei had arrived in the territory with the Northern Pacific Railroad, one of 800 Chinese laborers who laid steel tracks through granite mountains that claimed lives every single month. When heavy winter snow halted construction at Silver Creek, most of the railroad crews retreated toward San Francisco or headed south. Chun Wei chose to stay. He had saved $43 from months of back-breaking labor. He purchased a land claim for $12 and set out to build a future for his family. That first autumn, he constructed a standard frontier cabin. It measured 16 feet by 20 feet, built from hand-hewn logs chinked with local clay and dried river moss. On the north wall stood a massive stone fireplace, built according to the exact patterns used by every homestead within 50 miles. It was practical, proven, and completely standard. And during their very first winter, it nearly killed them. Here is the cold, hard truth that most modern history books overlook. The open fireplace, despite its iconic place in Western folklore, is fundamentally one of the most inefficient heating devices ever constructed by human hands. When wood burns in a standard hearth, heat behaves according to simple laws of physics that frontier settlers rarely questioned. As the timber burns, heat rises rapidly by convection. But because an open fireplace requires a massive vertical chimney to draw smoke out of the living space, up to 75% of the thermal energy generated by the burning wood goes straight up the flue and dissipates into the freezing night sky. The small portion of warmth that actually enters the room arrives strictly through direct radiant heat from the open flame. That means heat travels outward from a single point source. The closer you sit to the hearth, the warmer you feel. But heat dissipates quickly as distance increases. Worse still, as hot air rushes up the chimney stack, it creates a powerful negative pressure zone inside the cabin. That drop in air pressure actively pulls freezing outside air inward through every tiny gap in the log walls, every unsealed floorboard, and every window frame. During the winter of 1882, Chun Wei watched his family suffer under these exact physical laws. Every evening, his wife Jean and their two children, May and young Bo, huddled close to the stone hearth. Within 6 feet of the fire, the room might reach 75 degrees. But 10 feet away, near the sleeping pallets, the temperature hovered near 50. By 3 in the morning, when the wood burned down to low embers, the entire interior of the cabin plunged toward freezing. Every single morning, Chun Wei woke to find a solid sheet of ice covering the water bucket inside the room. His children woke up shivering, their breath blooming in heavy gray clouds in the dim morning light. Young Bo's fingertips turned waxy white from early frostbite, while Jean developed a dry, rattling cough that echoed off the frozen logs. To combat the relentless chill, Chun Wei spent his days cutting, splitting, and hauling wood until his hands were raw and his back throbbed with exhaustion. By the time spring thawed the valley, he had burned through 8 full cords of pine and Douglas fir. When he asked his neighbors about the crushing workload, men like Robert Finch, who had homesteaded in Silver Creek since 1876, simply shrugged their shoulders. "That is just the price of surviving in Montana," they told him. "Fire dies, the cabin freezes. You wake up, chop more wood, and build another fire. That is how a man faces winter out here." But Chun Wei remembered a completely different reality. He remembered his childhood in Shandong province, where winters were equally bitter, dry, and unforgiving. He remembered how his family's brick Kang, a masonry-heated sleeping platform built into the very foundation of their home, kept 3 generations warm through 12-hour nights on a single armful of dried brushwood. He remembered that fire was temporary, but dense stone could remember heat long after the last flame turned to ash. He sat on a log outside his melting cabin in April, sketching diagrams in the damp mud with a pointed stick. He calculated angles, flue pathways, and thermal storage ratios. His neighbors walked past and smiled, believing the quiet railroad worker was simply daydreaming. They did not realize that Chun Wei was preparing to challenge the entire architectural logic of the American West. By May of 1883, the spring thaw had finally arrived in Silver Creek. Mountain runoff roared through the valleys, turning the soil into thick clay mud. While his neighbors were busy planting vegetable patches and repairing winter fence lines, Chun Wei began dismantling the back wall of his cabin. He worked mostly alone, though his wife Jean hauled buckets of wet sand from the riverbed, and young Bo carried cedar scrap and fetch iron tools. Chun Wei was not merely rebuilding a fireplace. He was engineering a massive stone structure that dominated nearly 1/3 of the cabin's interior floor space. Here is what everyone missed. Instead of building a tall vertical hearth where fire burned openly against an outside wall, Chun Wei constructed a compact, ultra-dense firebox low to the floor on the north side. It measured just 18 inches wide and 14 inches deep, lined with specialized fire brick he had acquired by trading 2 full weeks of manual labor to a railway mason. But where a standard fireplace routed hot smoke straight up into the air, Chun Wei sealed the top of the firebox completely. He opened a horizontal passage at the back, routing the exhaust gases into a serpentine maze of stone and clay channels that ran beneath a raised sleeping platform. The platform stood 22 inches off the timber floor. It measured 8 feet wide by 10 feet long, providing enough elevated surface area for the entire family to rest together. Beneath that smooth sleeping surface lay a hidden grid of internal flues, forcing the blistering hot exhaust to travel nearly 15 feet horizontally before it reached the chimney flue on the far southern wall. Think about that distance for a moment. 15 feet of dense stone and wet clay absorbing every single unit of heat before the smoke was allowed to leave the building. To construct the mass, Chun Wei collected tons of rounded river stones from Silver Creek. Each stone was selected for density and lack of internal air pockets. But the true secret lay in the binder. Chun Wei knew that standard Western lime mortar or plain dirt would fracture under repeated heating and cooling cycles. He spent 2 weeks testing different soil ratios until he perfected a custom masonry formula: 3 parts local river clay, 2 parts coarse river sand, and 1 part fine ash sifted from hardwood cook fires, blended with just enough creek water to form a workable sticky paste. He built the platform in 3 distinct structural layers. The bottom layer consisted of coarse river rock for ground isolation and moisture drainage. The middle layer contained densely packed river stones, bonded with his ash clay mortar, forming the core thermal battery. The top layer was paved with smooth, flat schist stones, sealed tight and finished with a smooth 1/2-inch clay cap that dried into a polished, seamless floor. Between the scorching internal flue passages and the top sleeping surface, Chun Wei installed a 6-inch solid barrier of dense clay and small gravel. That 6-inch barrier was the critical safety buffer. It ensured that no matter how hot the interior flues burned, the sleeping surface above would never exceed a comfortable, gentle warmth. When fully assembled, the entire masonry platform weighed well over 850 pounds. To the settlers of Silver Creek, it looked like an absolute monstrosity. Samuel Hutchins, the master mason who had constructed over 200 brick chimneys across Montana Territory, rode out to the claim in mid-June. He stood in the doorway, looked at the massive mound of wet clay and river rock, sitting inside a wooden cabin, and shook his head in utter disbelief. "Son," Hutchins said, his voice carrying across the yard where neighbors had gathered to watch, "I have been laying stone for 23 years. What you are building in there is a death trap. You are placing your family's bed directly over an active combustion chamber. One crack in that wet clay barrier, one structural fracture from the weight, and that entire platform becomes an oven with your children sleeping on top of it." Chun Wei laid down his wooden trowel and spoke calmly. "The clay mixture is formulated to expand and contract without fracturing. The internal flue channels feature 3 cleanout access ports for seasonal maintenance, and the surface temperature will stabilize between 95 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough for human comfort, far below the threshold of danger." Hutchins stepped closer, pointing a thick finger at the horizontal flue. "You are forcing smoke to run sideways for 15 feet. That violates basic draft science. Hot air rises, cold air sinks. You cannot force hot exhaust to run sideways through 800 pounds of cold rock. The draft will stall, cold smoke will back up into the room, and carbon monoxide will suffocate your family while you sleep. A proper fireplace puts heat into the room and smoke up the chimney. What you are doing is completely backwards." "A proper fireplace," Chun Wei replied softly, "wastes 70% of its heat up that chimney stack. I am capturing the energy before it escapes." Word of the argument spread like wildfire through the territory. By late September, Chun Wei's heated platform had become the main topic of conversation at the Silver Creek Community Hall. During a Sunday gathering, Hutchins stood beside the potbelly stove and delivered a formal warning to the townspeople. He listed 4 major technical flaws: catastrophic fire risk from clay failure, structural collapse due to freeze, thaw cracking, carbon monoxide poisoning from stalled horizontal drafts, and a massive waste of labor and stone. The town agreed almost unanimously. Robert Finch called it foreign foolishness. Young Daniel Pritchard declared that a real man did not need to sleep on heated rocks, claiming his father had survived Wyoming blizzards with nothing more than an open fire and hard grit. Even fellow Chinese railroad workers urged Chun Wei to tear it down and build a standard American stove to avoid social isolation. Chun Wei listened to every objection, ignored the social pressure, and kept building. He added 3 extra feet of height to the vertical chimney on the south wall, mathematically calculating that the increased height would generate a powerful thermal siphon, pulling the exhaust through the horizontal flue, despite the friction loss. He built flush iron clean-out doors at every right-angle turn in the flue to prevent creosote buildup, and along the outer perimeter of the platform, he left narrow ventilation channels to ensure continuous air circulation around the timber frame. By late October, the clay mortar had cured completely. The structure sat solid, silent, and heavy, waiting for the first freeze of winter to deliver its final verdict. Now, let us decode the actual physics behind Chun Wei's design, because what the master mason called backwards was actually a masterclass in thermodynamics and off-grid safety engineering. Here is what everyone missed about how heat actually works in a cold climate. Heat is not a substance that disappears when a flame dies out. Heat is kinetic thermal energy transferred through 3 distinct mechanisms: conduction, convection, and radiation. A standard open fireplace relies almost entirely on high-temperature point-source radiation and rapid air convection. It burns wood at extremely high temperatures, creating a small zone of intense heat right in front of the hearth, while hot air rapidly rises toward the ceiling and exits through the flue. This creates high thermal turbulence, uneven room temperatures, and severe energy loss. Chun Wei's platform reversed this dynamic through 4 crucial engineering principles. First, thermal mass capacity. Dense materials like river stone, clay, and brick possess a high specific heat capacity and high density. When hot exhaust gases at 500 degrees Fahrenheit pass through the internal flue, the thermal energy is transferred directly into the masonry mass through conduction. Instead of escaping into the atmosphere, that energy is absorbed and trapped within the 850 pounds of stone and cured clay. The stone acts as a thermal battery, storing hundreds of thousands of British thermal units of energy during a brief, hot burn. Second, extended flue geometry. In a standard chimney, exhaust gases travel less than 20 inches horizontally before moving straight up into the open stack. Chun Wei expanded that thermal contact pathway to 15 feet. By forcing the hot exhaust to navigate a serpentine path, he maximized both the surface area of the masonry contact and the dwell time of the hot gases. By the time the exhaust finally exited the chimney stack on the outer wall, its temperature had dropped from 500 degrees to less than 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Over 70% of the waste heat had been stripped from the exhaust and dumped directly into the platform core. Third, low-temperature large-surface radiant heating. Once the thermal battery is charged, the stored energy slowly conducts outward toward the exterior surfaces of the platform. Because the top surface area measures 80 square feet, it does not need to be scorching hot to heat the cabin. By maintaining a gentle surface temperature of 85 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit across an 80 square foot plane, the platform radiates long-wave infrared heat upward into the room. Unlike warm air, which immediately rises to the ceiling and escapes, long-wave radiant heat directly warms solid objects, the human bodies resting on the platform, the wooden walls, and the floorboards. It creates a stable, draft-free environment with virtually zero air turbulence. Fourth, draft mechanics and carbon monoxide safety. The most dangerous assumption made by the townspeople was that smoke would back up due to the horizontal flue run. But Chun Wei understood fluid dynamics. Hot air rises because it is less dense than cold air, creating a pressure differential known as stack effect. By adding 3 extra feet of height to the vertical chimney stack on the exterior wall, Chun Wei created a powerful low-pressure zone at the chimney exit. This suction force, combined with the initial expansion of hot gases in the firebox, created a continuous, positive draft through the entire 15-foot horizontal flue. Furthermore, because the firebox was small and tightly sealed with an iron intake vent, the system consumed a fraction of the room's oxygen compared to an open hearth. Cold outside air was drawn directly into the primary intake, preventing dangerous negative pressure loops inside the cabin and eliminating the risk of carbon monoxide backdrafting into the living space. Chun Wei had not built a bath or a death trap. He had engineered a self-regulating, highly efficient thermal transfer machine that operated on pure physical laws. All it needed was an extreme winter to prove it. On January 9th, 1884, the sky above Montana Territory turned a hard crystal blue. A massive polar vortex descended directly from the Arctic, locking itself over the region with unyielding weight. The cold that followed was not a brief cold snap. It was a sustained, brutal siege. The thermometer outside the Silver Creek Community Hall read minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit on January 10th, minus 31 on the 11th, and dropped to minus 35 degrees on January 14th. And then it stayed there. For 18 consecutive days, the temperature never rose above minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was so bone-dry, it seared the inside of your lungs. Spit froze solid before hitting the ground. Leather harness straps snapped like glass, and metal tools became dangerous to touch with bare skin. It was the exact kind of weather that relentlessly hunted for every structural weakness in every cabin across the territory. Settlers were plunged into desperate survival mode. Families who had carefully cut and stacked what they believed was an ample supply of firewood burned through their entire wood piles in less than 12 days. To keep a standard cabin above freezing overnight, someone had to stay awake around the clock, feeding split logs into the fireplace every 2 hours. Exhaustion became universal. Fathers took the watch until midnight, mothers took the shift until 3 in the morning, and older children took the dawn watch. Yet, despite those constant fires, temperatures inside standard cabins crashed to 25 degrees by dawn. Ice formed on interior log walls, window panes coated over with thick white frost, and children slept under 4 layers of heavy quilts, shivering uncontrollably in their day clothes. By January 20th, families were burning fence posts, spare furniture, and barn timbers just to keep their living spaces from turning into ice boxes. Respiratory infections spread rapidly through the settlement. Children developed deep chest coughs, while elderly homesteaders suffered from painful chilblains and frostbitten toes. And then, on January 22nd, the 18th consecutive day below minus 35 degrees, Dr. Milton Ashford rode out to Chun Wei's claim. Dr. Ashford was a Philadelphia-trained physician, practical, evidence-based, and deeply concerned. He was visiting the Wei claim because Jean had sent word through a neighbor that 7-year-old May had developed a fever. Ashford feared the worst pneumonia, the quiet killer that claimed dozens of frontier children every winter in freezing, drafty cabins. He dismounted his horse, wrapped his scarf tighter around his face, and knocked on the timber door. When Chun Wei opened it, Dr. Ashford received a physical shock that stopped him dead in his tracks. A wall of soft, encompassing heat rolled out into the frozen afternoon. Ashford stepped inside, closed the door, and stood motionless. The cabin was warm, not merely tolerable or survivable, but genuinely, completely comfortable. May was lying on the raised stone sleeping platform, wearing a thin cotton nightgown, resting under a single light blanket. Jean was moving around the kitchen area in a simple cotton dress. 4-year-old Beau was sitting on the wooden floor near the edge of the platform, playing barefoot. Ashford looked toward the north wall. The small firebox contained nothing more than a tiny bed of glowing coals, with 2 small splits of pine resting on top. There was no roaring blaze, no suffocating cloud of wood smoke, and no bitter draft rushing across the floorboards. The physician set down his medical bag, reached into his coat pocket, and pulled out a glass room thermometer. He placed it on a wooden shelf along the west wall, far away from the firebox, and waited 3 minutes. The mercury rose and stabilized at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the air temperature read minus 32 below zero. "When did you last add wood to that firebox?" Dr. Ashford asked, his voice filled with genuine astonishment. Chun Wei glanced at the window. "Maybe 2 hours ago," he replied. "I will add 3 small splits at sunset. That will be enough to keep the room warm until dawn." Dr. Ashford looked at the massive stone platform, then back at the small firebox. He touched the surface of the platform near where the sick child lay. The stone was warm to the touch, like a smooth river rock basking in summer sunlight, yet entirely safe and comfortable. He walked to the far southern edge of the platform, nearly 10 feet away from the heat source. The stone surface there was equally, consistently warm. "Mr. Wei," Dr. Ashford said slowly, "I need to document this scientifically. May I return tomorrow morning before sunrise? Before you light your morning fire?" Chun Wei nodded peacefully. "Come at 5:45. You will see for yourself." The next morning, January 23rd, Dr. Ashford arrived at the cabin at 5:47 in the morning. The outside temperature read minus 34 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun would not rise for another hour. This was the absolute coldest, most dangerous point in the 24-hour cycle, the hour when cabin temperatures across Silver Creek plummeted into the 20s. He knocked, and Chun Wei opened the door immediately. Inside, the firebox was completely dead. Nothing remained inside the chamber except cold gray ash and a few charcoal cinders. The fire had burned out around midnight, 5 full hours of zero active combustion. Dr. Ashford pulled out his thermometer and measured temperatures across 3 distinct locations in the room. Near the sleeping platform, the air temperature registered 59 degrees Fahrenheit. In the center of the room, it read 56 degrees. Near the outer doorway, the coldest spot in any cabin, it registered 52 degrees. Think about those numbers for a moment. With a dead fire, on a morning when the outside temperature hit 34 below zero, the coolest spot inside Chun Wei's cabin remained 20 degrees above freezing, while the sleeping area remained at nearly 60 degrees. Just 2 days earlier, Dr. Ashford had visited the Pritchard cabin at 6 in the morning. Daniel Pritchard's fire had been dead for 3 hours. The interior temperature of his tightly chinked cabin had dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Daniel and his wife were huddled under 4 heavy quilts, their breath freezing onto the window panes, desperately trying to restart a blaze with numb, shivering fingers. The contrast was impossible to deny. Dr. Ashford walked outside with Chun Wei to inspect the woodpile. Chun Wei had started the winter in November with 4 cords of split pine. After 8 weeks of continuous winter use, including 18 days of a severe polar vortex, he had consumed roughly 2½ cords. At that consumption rate, Chun Wei would burn slightly over 3 cords for the entire 5-month winter season. Every other household in Silver Creek was burning 8 to 10 cords for the exact same period. Chun Wei was consuming 60% less wood while maintaining an interior environment nearly 30 degrees warmer than his neighbors. To eliminate any doubt, Dr. Ashford requested permission to conduct an overnight temperature monitoring study during the night of January 26th to 27th. The night forecasters predicted would be the absolute coldest of the entire year. Chun Wei agreed. At 8 in the evening, with outside temperatures dropping rapidly, Chun Wei built a hot initial burn in the firebox, loading 6 small splits of pine. By 9:30, the top surface of the stone platform measured 97 degrees Fahrenheit. The family went to sleep at 10 o'clock. Dr. Ashford sat in a wooden chair with his pocket watch, notebook, and thermometer, recording temperature readings every hour on the hour. At 10 at night, interior room temperature stood at 69 degrees. Surface platform at 96 degrees, with active fire. At midnight, interior room temperature read 66 degrees. Surface platform 92 degrees, fire reduced to low coals. At 2 in the morning, interior room temperature stood at 62 degrees, surface platform 86 degrees, fire dead cinders. At 4 in the morning, interior room temperature registered 58 degrees, surface platform 78 degrees, fire completely dead. At 6 in the morning, as dawn broke across the frozen mountains, the outside temperature plunged to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the cabin, with no active fire for over 4 hours, the interior room temperature held firm at 56 degrees Fahrenheit, while the platform surface remained at 72 degrees. A 74-degree temperature differential between the inside of the cabin and the Arctic wind outside, maintained entirely by the slow, continuous discharge of stored thermal energy from 850 pounds of river rock and clay. Dr. Ashford recorded his final entry, shut his notebook, and walked straight to the home of Samuel Hutchins. He handed the master mason his detailed temperature logs and medical observations. Hutchins read through the columns of numbers twice. He looked out his frosted window at Chun Wei's cabin, sitting quietly across the valley, took a deep breath, and spoke 4 words that changed everything. "I need to see it." On the afternoon of February 2nd, 1884, Samuel Hutchins rode out to the Wei claim alone. He did not bring witnesses or tools. He walked into the cabin, removed his heavy leather gloves, and knelt beside the sleeping platform. He placed both palms flat onto the smooth clay surface. He moved his hands across the stone near the firebox, across the middle section, and along the far end. The entire 80-square-foot surface radiated an even, soothing warmth. He walked over to the firebox. The fire inside was tiny, burning 3 small splits of pine. He examined the tight iron intake door, traced the path of the horizontal flue along the wall, and inspected the 3 clean-out access doors. There was no smell of wood smoke, no signs of structural cracking, and no condensation damage anywhere along the clay mortar. Hutchins straightened up, met Chun Wei's eyes, and spoke with absolute honesty. "I was wrong," Hutchins said. "I told this entire settlement that your design was a dangerous death trap. I have built 200 chimneys in Montana Territory, and I was convinced I understood heat and stone. But I only understood heat rising up a chimney. I did not understand thermal storage. I did not understand that you could turn stone into a storage battery for fire." Chun Wei set down his work and replied quietly. "The principle is over 2,000 years old in China. It is not new physics, Mr. Hutchins. It is simply new to this valley." "It is new to me," Hutchins admitted. "But numbers do not lie, and comfort does not lie. This system works far better than anything we have been building. I will tell the town I was wrong." Hutchins kept his promise. At the next community meeting, he publicly retracted his warnings, explaining the engineering mechanics of thermal mass storage to the assembled homesteaders. The reaction was immediate. When a respected master mason publicly admits he was wrong, people pay attention. By the spring of 1884, 3 homesteaders had approached Chun Wei asking for exact construction blueprints. Chun Wei freely shared his clay mortar formula, his draft calculations, and his serpentine flue layouts without charging a single penny. In March of 1884, Robert Finch became the first settler to build an adapted version of the heated platform in his own cabin, constructing a 6-by-8-foot stone heater with Hutchins' masonry assistance. During the following winter, Finch's firewood consumption dropped from 9 cords down to 4.5 cords. By winter of 1885, 23 households across 3 counties had incorporated some form of masonry thermal mass heating into their log homes. Some built full sleeping platforms like Chun Wei's original design. Others constructed heated stone benches along interior walls, while others wrapped massive stone storage walls around existing fireboxes. The foreign contraption that everyone had mocked quickly acquired local names: the bed stove, the stone heater, or the Hutchins platform. And even when settlers credited the mason, Hutchins always corrected them, pointing toward Chun Wei's homestead. Young Daniel Pritchard, who had once claimed that real men did not hide under heated rocks, built a stone platform in his cabin in October of 1885. When neighbors asked him about the sudden change of heart, Pritchard smiled sheepishly and said, "Turns out there is a big difference between facing winter and being foolish about it." In 1886, Dr. Ashford published an extensive medical paper in the Montana Medical Journal, documenting a drastic reduction in winter respiratory illnesses, frostbite, and child mortality among families using thermal mass radiant heating compared to traditional open fireplaces. Chun Wei never sought fame or financial gain. He simply farmed his claim, raised his children in a warm home, and helped his neighbors survive the brutal frontier winters. Here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. The exact thermal mass engineering that Chun Wei constructed in 1883 is now being rediscovered by modern green building engineers and sustainable architects. Known today as masonry heaters or rocket mass heaters, these systems are marketed as cutting-edge alternative heating technology, selling for thousands of dollars in eco-friendly home designs. Yet, they operate on the exact same physical laws that Chun Wei brought from Shandong Province to Montana Territory over a century ago. Capture waste heat energy, store it in dense thermal mass, and radiate long-wave warmth continuously over time. What looks primitive to the arrogant is often just practical wisdom they have not earned yet. Fire is fleeting, but warm stone remembers heat long after the flames have turned to ash. That is not superstition. That is physics that worked in ancient Asia, worked on the frozen Montana frontier in 1884, and still works today wherever human beings need to stay warm through a long, dark night. The story of Chun Wei and the winter of 1884 is more than a historical curiosity. It is a timeless lesson in human resilience, physical truth, and the quiet power of practical wisdom. In a frontier territory dominated by tradition and pride, one man refused to accept that suffering was the unavoidable cost of survival. He did not build his heated platform to make a statement or win an argument. He built it because he loved his family, understood the laws of nature, and knew that captured thermal energy beats wasted energy every single time. When the snows finally melted in the spring of 1884, 23 families across 3 counties began rebuilding their own fireplaces, turning cold stone into life-saving thermal batteries. They survived not because they conquered winter with brute force, but because they had the humility to learn from someone who held knowledge they had overlooked. The next time you face a difficult problem, whether in off-grid building or in life, remember the stone sleeping platform of Silver Creek. What looks unconventional to the arrogant is often just ancient wisdom waiting for those wise enough to listen. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational, storytelling, and historical analysis purposes. Characters, specific names, and individual dialogue are narrative dramatizations, while the engineering concepts, thermal mass principles, and historical practices discussed are based on well-established physical laws and documented historical building techniques. Any modern construction or heating installation should always be evaluated according to current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations.